Video games have a unique problem that other forms of media don't really have, and that is the issue of them becoming incompatible with the evolution of technology. If you have any experience with game engines, you'll know that it is pretty much a miracle that games work at all.
Let's turn it on.
And transferring all of these elements that need to interact correctly with all these other elements to a completely different system isn't as simple as reprinting a book or re-rendering a film. Often things just boom break.
Wow, that actually sounded so good.
Oh yeah, it's like a whole choir kind of.
Back in the early 2010s, HD collections were all the rage. They served as a cost-effective way to bundle classic games into one package, allowing fans to relive their favourite titles in high definition, without needing to track down old hardware or deal with blurry visuals on modern TVs. At the time, emulation wasn't nearly as advanced as it is now, and backwards compatibility on consoles, especially the PlayStation 3, was hit or miss. Sure, the PS3 originally had a backwards compatible model, but it was expensive and eventually phased out.
Are you crazy? Are you out of your mind?
Leaving fans with no simple way to revisit older titles. For Xbox owners, backwards compatibility was slightly more reliable, but not perfect. Still, there was a clear demand for high definition re-releases, and that demand was met with a wave of HD collections across multiple franchises. Games like Sly, Ratchet & Clank, Jak and Daxter, Devil May Cry, and God of War all saw successful HD remasters during this period, making their way into gamers' hands in a more accessible and visually updated form. In 2012, the DragonballZ Budokai series was also given the HD treatment, or rather, a version of it. The collection wasn't quite as comprehensive as you may have hoped, only including Budokai 1 and Budokai 3, while leaving out Budokai 2 entirely. As someone who has already ranted about this decision elsewhere, I'll spare you the details. But it was still an exciting release at the time, back when I still had hope. With the Budokai series getting a fresh coat of paint, many, including myself, believed it was only a matter of time before the Budokai Tenkaichi series would follow suit. After all, the Tenkaichi games were arguably more popular than the Budokai series. They had a larger roster, more dynamic combat, and featured beloved modes that fans still talk about to this day. It seemed inevitable that the Tenkaichi trilogy would get its own HD collection, but it never happened. And the question is,
Why?
when HD collections were dominating the market, the Budokai Tenkaichi series was still relatively fresh in the minds of fans. The third and final entry, Budokai Tenkaichi 3, had been released on both the PlayStation 2 and the Wii just a few years earlier. While the Wii wasn't an HD console, it was technically part of the 7th generation, which might have been one of the reasons the series wasn't re-released immediately. After all, it hadn't been that long since the last game came out, and perhaps the publisher didn't want to cannibalize sales for their newer titles, like Raging Blast or even Tenkaichi Tag Team. Another possible reason was that the Dragon Ball game franchise itself was on somewhat of a downward trajectory in the early 2010s. The anime series had long since ended, and while the brand remained popular, it didn't have the same momentum it would regain years later with the release of Dragon Ball Super. Without that revitalization, the demand for Dragon Ball games may not have seemed strong enough to warrant a full re-release of the Tenkaichi trilogy. But whatever the reasons were at the time, the situation has changed dramatically. With emulation now much more advanced and digital distribution more accessible than ever, there is no better moment than now for a Tenkaichi trilogy re-release. The interest in Dragon Ball games is as high as it's ever been, especially with the recent release of Sparking Zero. There's no reason why these iconic games should remain locked behind aging hardware and skyrocketing resale prices.
Oh my god. I am never gonna financially recover from this.
There are several compelling reasons why a Tenkaichi trilogy re-release would make sense in today's gaming landscape. First and foremost is accessibility. The price of physical copies of the Tenkaichi games has been steadily climbing over the years, particularly for Budokai Tenkaichi 3, which is widely regarded as the pinnacle of the series. With the original discs becoming more scarce and expensive, it's becoming increasingly difficult for new players or returning fans to experience these games without resorting to emulation or venturing out on the high seas, if you know what I mean. I mean, what? It's completely legal. I'd never do anything that you're not meant to do. And while I'm all for emulation, there's something to be said about having an official, legitimate way to play these classics on modern hardware. A re-release would benefit both players and collectors. Gamers who simply want to play the game would no longer need to fork out an absurd amount of money to secure a copy, while collectors could rest easy knowing that the market for their rare discs wouldn't be driven up even higher by competition with casual players. Everyone wins! Moreover, the Tenkaichi series isn't just a set of fun fighting games, it's a cornerstone of Dragon Ball gaming history. These games are often remembered fondly for their massive character rosters, their fast-paced, high-flying combat, and their faithful recreations of iconic moments from the anime. They represent an era of Dragon Ball games that was defined by over-the-top action and ambitious scope. In many ways, they laid the groundwork for what would eventually become Dragon Ball Xenoverse and other modern DBZ games. For fans who grew up with these games, a re-release would be a nostalgic trip down memory lane, while for newcomers, it would be a chance to experience what made these titles so special in the first place. And with the recent resurgence of interest in older games, there's no reason why the Tenkaichi trilogy couldn't find a new audience today. They could even take this opportunity to revert to the original Japanese sparking title. By doing this, not only would they be honouring the roots of the franchise, but they'd also be setting up a more cohesive branding for whatever comes next, while also sparking interest among new players. The argument against re-releasing older games often boils down to concerns about market competition with newer titles. After all, why would a company want to potentially undercut the sales of its new games by offering cheaper re-releases of older ones? But I don't think this logic applies here. In fact, a re-release of the Tenkaichi trilogy could complement the release of Sparking Zero, offering fans a way to revisit the classics while also exploring the new game. There's something to be said for having a sense of continuation in a gaming franchise and allowing fans to play through the original trilogy. It's not about replacing the new with the old, it's about giving fans the full picture of how the Tenkaichi games have evolved over time. It's a win-win situation for both the publisher and the fans. Finally, we need to talk about the importance of preservation. Video games are an art form, and like any other art form, they deserve to be preserved and accessible for future generations. But unlike books, films, or music, video games are more vulnerable to being lost to time due to the rapid pace of technological change. A re-release of the Tenkaichi trilogy would be a step towards ensuring that these games aren't forgotten as newer titles take their place. There's something incredibly valuable about being able to revisit the past, not just for nostalgia's sake, but to understand how far the medium has come. The Tenkaichi trilogy represents a moment in time when I think the Dragon Ball games were at their most ambitious, and it would be a shame for that moment in history to be lost just because technology has moved on. In a world where gaming technology is constantly evolving and old hardware becomes obsolete, it's essential to find ways to keep classic games alive. The Budokai Tenkaichi trilogy stands as one of the most iconic series in Dragon Ball gaming history, and there's no reason why it should remain locked away from modern audiences. Whether it's through a digital re-release, an HD collection, or even just a basic port, the Tenkaichi games deserve to be accessible to as many people as possible. The demand is there, the technology is there, and the timing couldn't be better. I mean, how much more of a hint do they need? Just release it already, for fuck's sake. Why blue bagging, balling, whatever the fuck that means.